Sicilian origins. After feudalism collapsed in the early 19th century, Sicily turned into a wild economic experiment. With the end of primogeniture and a flood of land redistributions, the number of landowners exploded from around 2,000 in 1812 to over 20,000 by 1861. It sounds democratic until you realize nobody knew how to protect their new land. Enter the Gabellati. These were lease agents who turned into mini warlords. They hired armed guards called campieri, controlled farmland like little monarchs, and quietly birthed what would eventually evolve into the Mafia. There were less than 350 police officers on the entire island, and many towns didn't even have a permanent law enforcement presence. With no one to enforce the law, criminals stepped up. Peasants, starved by rising food prices and stripped of access to traditional common lands, started turning to theft. Banditry surged, so landowners hired private muscle to act as judge, jury, and enforcer. These guards, often led by former bandits, formed tight crews, loyal to the land agents instead of the law. That chaos made the Mafia possible. Protection groups didn't just pop up randomly, they were a business. They operated like security companies, but with way more guns and way fewer uniforms. By the late 1800s, organized crews were everywhere. They had codes, hand signals, and their own warped version of justice. One report from Palermo in 1864 described a secret sect made up of smugglers, thieves, and rich farmers. These guys were already building networks, settling disputes, and swearing each other to silence. The Mafia didn't need the government because they were the government. When people's cattle got stolen, the Mafia could recover up to 95%. The police barely managed 10%. That made it really easy for rural communities to rely on these syndicates, especially since they actually got results. The Mafia had already proven they could get things done, so why bother with the official system? By the 1890s, Palermo's chief of police, Ermanno Sangiorgi, was tracking over 600 members across at least 8 clans. These weren't just thugs. They had ceremonies, initiation rites, and a full-blown structure. One recorded initiation from 1876 described saints, candles, and blood oaths. They were building an identity. They also knew how to play politics. Mafiosi started twisting rural elections by buying votes, intimidating opponents, and trading loyalty for political favors. If you ran for office and wanted to win, you needed friends who didn't ask questions and could encourage the right ballots. These rural bosses made themselves useful enough to avoid crackdowns, while their behind-the-scenes power just kept growing. The real money came from sulfur and citrus. Both were booming industries, but they were easy targets for theft and sabotage. Farmers needed protection, and since there was no real law, the Mafia stepped in. In towns with sulfur mines or big lemon groves, the Mafia's presence grew stronger. More money meant more reason to hire tough guys who could protect your goods, shut down rivals, and make sure nobody messed with your operation. So by the mid-19th century, Sicily had something entirely new. Land agents were calling shots like kings. Gangs were running entire regions, and traditional institutions were crumbling. It was all tied together through secrecy, violence, and loyalty. The Mafia wasn't just about crime, it was a system, a self-made answer to a broken world. Early US arrival and conflicts. Between 1880 and 1924, more than 4 million Italians arrived in the United States, most of them from the South, including Sicily. They poured into places like East Harlem, the Lower East Side, Brooklyn, and New Orleans, building tight-knit Little Italy neighborhoods. These places gave Sicilians comfort, language familiarity, and a kind of home-away-from-home vibe. But they also created perfect conditions for organized crime to sneak in and set up shop. Sicilian mafiosi didn't leave their methods behind. They brought over the whole setup: omertà, hierarchy, secret rituals, everything. Those traditions shaped what eventually became known in America as La Cosa Nostra, and they didn't waste time. The Mafia culture evolved fast, with local crews forming in port cities and copying the structure they grew up with back home. The Black Hand racket popped up first. Around 1900, letters with creepy symbols, handprints, skulls, crosses started showing up at shops and homes. These were extortion notes, and if you didn't pay, your business might burn down, or worse. That protection money didn't really protect anything except the people threatening you. They didn't stop there. Gambling rings and labor rackets took hold, especially in busy ports where immigrant labor was easy to exploit. This wasn't just random crime. It was organized, planned, and operated like a business. New Orleans saw the earliest Mafia roots. Back in the 1860s, Sicilian gangs from Palermo, Messina, and Trapani were already in turf wars. By 1868, the city was already dealing with Mafia-style violence. It escalated in 1890 when Police Chief David Hennessy was assassinated. 19 Italians were arrested, most were acquitted, and the city exploded. In March of 1891, a lynch mob stormed the jail and killed 11 Sicilian defendants. It became one of the deadliest hate crimes in US history. As brutal as it was, it also fueled internal Mafia solidarity and deepened distrust in the legal system. One of the first Mafia families in the country came out of New Orleans. The Matranga brothers built a racket, extorting dock workers and produce handlers in the 1870s. They weren't subtle, And they weren't small time. These guys knew how to run the ports. Meanwhile, New York was its own chaotic mess. In the 1880s, Sicilian crews like the Morello family clashed with Neapolitan Camorra gangs. These turf battles tore through East Harlem and Brooklyn. Everything boiled over in 1915 after Giosuè Gallucci, known as the King of Little Italy, was murdered. The Mafia Camorra War exploded, and by 1918, Camorra leaders were convicted. Their power shattered. The Morellos came out on top, and just like that, the Sicilian Mafia cemented its control in New York. By the early 20th century, Mafia-linked families were dug in deep across New York, New Orleans, Chicago, and San Francisco. They borrowed heavily from Sicilian models, coded communication, blood oath ceremonies, and top-down leadership. They didn't just run rackets, they sank their claws into politics, using vote manipulation and court bribery to secure their power. These early years laid the foundation for everything that came later. 4 million immigrants provided plenty of manpower and community cover. The fall of the Camorra cleared the field for the Sicilian Mafia. The lynching in New Orleans turned mistrust into resolve, and the structure that grew in those decades, tight-knit crews, loyalty through silence, and total independence from the law set the stage for the explosive growth during Prohibition and beyond. Feel free to smash that like and subscribe button for more content like this. Anyways, Prohibition boom. When the 18th Amendment took effect in January of 1920, the floodgates didn't close. They just changed direction. Alcohol became illegal nationwide, and the Mafia pounced. With the Volstead Act enforcing the ban, gangs quickly took over everything from brewing and distilling to importation and distribution. Police were barely a presence, and bribery made everything easier. Officials got paid and the booze kept flowing. The money was staggering. Al Capone, running things in Chicago, reportedly pulled in somewhere between $60 and $100 million a year from bootlegging during the 1920s. Adjusted for today, that's well over $1 billion. Even with federal raids costing his operation around $9 million, it barely scratched the surface of what his empire was raking in. And he wasn't the only one cashing in. Smuggling routes turned rivers and highways into lifelines for illegal booze. Street gangs leveled up into full-blown criminal organizations, supplying speakeasies from coast to coast, and the competition? Brutal. Bombings, assassinations, drive-by shootings. It was non-stop. The homicide rate skyrocketed, and cities became battlegrounds. Everyone wanted a slice of the liquor pie, and nobody planned to share. Law enforcement was hopelessly outmatched. In the early years, only 134 agents covered Illinois, Iowa, and Wisconsin combined. It was like bringing a butter knife to a machine gun fight. Eventually, the government tried to fight back. Elliot Ness and his team, famously called the Untouchables, were formed to tackle Capone's empire. They shut down operations worth $500,000 at the time, nearly $10 million today. It helped, but it didn't stop the system from growing. Al Capone wasn't just a thug with a Tommy gun. He played the political game too, donating huge sums, like $250,000, to friendly figures such as Chicago's mayor, William Hale Thompson. Capone knew the rules of the streets and the halls of power. That's why he lasted as long as he did. Then there was Arnold Rothstein in New York. By 1925, he was the country's biggest bootlegger. His network was worth around $10 million at the time, and he had a long list of proteges, including Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky. Rothstein wasn't flashy like Capone. He was quiet, calculated, and always 10 steps ahead. His influence reshaped organized crime into something colder, sharper, and far more efficient. Meanwhile, back in Sicily, Mussolini had his own problems. He sent Cesare Mori, known as the Iron Prefect, to crush the Mafia. Over 11,000 suspects were arrested, and more than 1,200 were convicted. Mafiosi knew they had to leave or lose everything. Many fled to the United States, bringing with them years of experience and connections. Carlo Gambino and Joseph Bonanno were just two of the major figures who built new power centers after leaving Sicily during that crackdown. The effects of Prohibition weren't temporary. The bootlegging profits dwarfed older rackets like gambling or extortion. That money allowed mafia families to expand into new cities, bribe more politicians, and tighten their grip on labor unions and law enforcement. By the time Prohibition ended in 1933, the mafia had outgrown alcohol. They were ready for gambling, narcotics, loan sharking, whatever made money. They had cash, structure, and reach. And it all started because the country tried to ban booze. Castellammarese War and Commission formation. From February of 1930 through April of 1931, New York's criminal underworld lit up with one of the bloodiest power struggles in mafia history. Joe, the boss, Masseria, backed by allies like Lucky Luciano, Albert Anastasia, Vito Genovese, and Frank Costello, went to war against Salvatore Maranzano's Castellammarese faction. Maranzano had his own lineup of heavy hitters, including Joseph Bonanno, Stefano Magaddino, Joe Profaci, and Joe Aiello. It wasn't just about turf, it was a battle between old-school Sicilian bosses known as Must-Ache Petes and the younger, more Americanized gangsters often called the Young Turks. Liquor shipments hijacked, alliances tested, and blood spilled across boroughs. The Young Turks were tired of outdated codes and rigid power. The Mustake Petes clung to tradition and absolute control. Luciano saw the writing on the wall. He played both sides, waited for the perfect moment, and struck. On April 15, 1931, Luciano had Joe Masseria lured to Nuova Via, Tamaro in Coney Island. While Masseria played cards, Luciano excused himself, and in walked a hit squad: Genovese, Anastasia, Louis Lepka Buchalter, and Benjamin Siegel. Masseria didn't make it out. The chair he died in, still standing in a museum somewhere? Maranzano thought that cleared the way for him. He declared himself capo di tutti I capi, boss of all bosses, and reshaped New York into 5 structured families named for the current bosses: Luciano, Mangano, Galliano, Bonanno, and Profaci. He wanted old-world obedience and loyalty, but he made a mistake. He underestimated Luciano's ambition. 5 months later, on September 10, 1931, Maranzano met his end. Luciano sent men disguised as law enforcement into Maranzano's office. They stabbed and shot him to death on the spot. Just like that, the era of boss of bosses was finished. Luciano wanted something new. Later that year, in Chicago, he called a meeting that would reshape organized crime in America. Out of that summit came the Commission. It wasn't a monarchy anymore, it was a boardroom. The original members included the heads of the 5 families in New York, Al Capone representing Chicago, and Stefano Magaddino for Buffalo. Luciano took the chairman role, but the power was spread out. No more single rulers, no more senseless killing for control. The Commission handled disputes, approved new bosses, and divided up territories like it was a corporate blueprint. Meetings were held nationally when needed, and every decision was aimed at reducing infighting and maximizing profit. It didn't erase violence, but it made it strategic. Under Luciano's leadership, the Mafia also began, collaborating with trusted non-Italian partners. Jewish figures like Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, and Louis Buchalter weren't formal commission members, but they had influence, access, and a voice in major decisions. This opened the door for broader criminal cooperation across ethnic lines. The shift turned the Mafia into a national network. Families across the country, from Philadelphia to Detroit to New England, aligned under the Commission's loose but powerful control. Decades later, it was still calling shots, including decisions like denying Dutch Schultz's request to kill a prosecutor in 1935. That refusal and Schultz's defiance got him killed. The Commission era began where the Castellammarese War ended, with a dead boss, a new order, and a playbook that turned criminal chaos into a streamlined empire. Organized crime empire. When Prohibition collapsed in December of 1933, the Mafia didn't miss a beat. They took all that bootlegging cash and shifted gears fast, diving into gambling, loan sharking, labor rackets, narcotics, prostitution, and even worming into legitimate businesses. Historians started calling them sophisticated enterprises, which is just a fancy way of saying they leveled up from gangsters to full-on business moguls with guns. Gambling became the new cash cow. In the mid to late 1940s, the Mafia poured money into Las Vegas, starting with the Flamingo in 1946. From there, it snowballed. Stardust, Sahara, Tropicana, Desert Inn, and Riviera followed in the 1950s. These weren't just investments, they were cash machines. Mafia crews skimmed millions off the top before the money ever hit the books. That money? It went straight back to their syndicates. Clean and quiet. Unions were next. The Mafia didn't just infiltrate, they owned them. They burrowed into the Teamsters, the longshoremen, construction trades, the garment sector, any group with dues and influence. Extortion, embezzlement, bribery, and rigged votes were business as usual. The Lucchese family, for example, ran trucking and garment unions in New York like their personal ATM. They used that control to manipulate bids, secure contracts, and collect kickbacks. By 1957, the Senate Rackets Committee blew the lid off, dragging union bosses into the spotlight and forcing some real reforms. But money didn't stop there. Loan sharking filled in the gaps. Mafia lenders charged sky-high interest and didn't care if you paid late, because they had people for that. At the same time, they dipped into tax fraud, stock scams, and even gas tax evasion schemes that raked in hundreds of millions. These weren't just street corner hustles. These were national financial crimes wrapped in pinstripes. Narcotics trafficking crept in during the late 1940s and 50s. Heroin was a steady income stream for East Coast families, even if they didn't parade it around. It wasn't flashy, but it was profitable and persistent, especially through networks that stretched across cities and ports. The Commission stayed active through it all. Formed back in 1931, it continued acting as a criminal boardroom, resolving disputes and guiding national operations. Alongside it, The National Crime Syndicate, created in 1929, linked around 14 criminal groups across different ethnic backgrounds. Jewish and Italian mobs collaborated, and when someone needed to disappear, they called Murder, Inc. Sobana the enforcement squad operating from the 30s into the 40s. Things weren't exactly quiet. In 1957, more than 100 mobsters gathered at the Appalachian Meeting in rural New York. Law enforcement raided it, and suddenly the public could no longer pretend these guys didn't exist. That raid confirmed the national structure and forced the federal government to treat the mafia like an organized threat. The Senate and Department of Justice followed up with aggressive investigations into union corruption. They went after the Teamsters, dock workers, and even restaurant unions. Subpoenas flew, and so did indictments. At their peak, mafia-connected officials ran more than 100 union locals in New York alone. The money, casinos, rackets, and scams were pulling in tens to hundreds of millions each year. They weren't just criminals anymore. They were architects of a national network that blended violence, money, and influence like clockwork. The mafia didn't vanish after Prohibition. It evolved, diversified, and built an empire. Bigger, richer, and more coordinated than anything they'd run before. Heroin era and pizza connection. After the French Connection pipeline crumbled in the early 1970s, a new heroin empire rose. And it wasn't in Marseille anymore. The action shifted to Palermo, where Sicilian bosses stepped in fast. They sourced morphine base from Turkey, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, then processed it in Sicily. At its peak, they were churning out around 2 metric tons of pure heroin every year. By 1982, they controlled about 80% of the heroin coming into the northeastern United States, and a lot of it was funneled straight through pizza joints. That's where the pizza connection came in. Between 1975 and 1984, an elaborate trafficking network moved heroin through pizzerias scattered across New York, New Jersey, Illinois, and Wisconsin. The morphine came through Turkey, got refined in Sicilian labs by Corsican chemists, places like Pirineto and Trebia, then landed in the US inside tomato cans and cheese crates. The Bonanno and Gambino families teamed up with Sicilian clans to pull it off. The network was massive, over 1,650 pounds of heroin smuggled into the country in just 5 years. All told, the heroin moved through this setup was worth around $1.6 billion. One of the top players was Gaetano Dontano Badalamenti. He ran things out of Chinisi, headed the Sicilian Commission, and co-led the whole operation. In 1984, he was busted in Spain along with his son Vito. After extradition, Dontano was handed a 45-year sentence and a $125,000 fine. Not cheap. In New York, Salvatore Toto Catalano, capo in the Bonanno family, ran the U.S. logistics. He got 45 years and a fine of over $1 million. Gaspare Mutallo, another Sicilian middleman, helped move 400 kilograms of heroin, half to the Contrera Caruana clan and half to John Gambino in New York. This wasn't just street-level dealing. The entire thing was global. Heroin was bought in bulk in Turkey from traffickers like Yasar Musululu, processed in Sicily, and slipped into the U.S. via pizza shops. Then the profits were washed through Swiss bank accounts, shady brokerage firms, and real estate holdings. The whole operation ran on international connections and ridiculous amounts of cash. By 1985, it all caught up. The pizza connection trial kicked off in September. It lasted 17 months, the longest federal criminal trial in U.S. history. In March of 1987, the verdicts dropped. 18 out of 22 defendants were convicted. Authorities seized everything: pizzerias, bank records, drug labs, and accounts tied to laundering. Years of secrecy unraveled in a courtroom. Behind the scenes, the operation ran on transatlantic cooperation. Palermo bosses like Stefano Bontate and Salvatore Inzerillo sold heroin to the Gambino family for about $50,000 per kilo. The Americans flipped it at $130,000. That kind of markup turned into $35 million a year for the Sicilians and $90 million for their American buyers. The Contrera Caruana clan had been in the game since the 1950s, and they became key dealers, moving weight and making deals with both sides. The pizza connection exposed how deeply connected the mafia had become, how far the reach extended, and how tight the operations were. Testimonies from insiders like Tommaso Buscetta pulled back the curtain on Cosa Nostra's hierarchy and global reach. Law enforcement wasn't flying solo either. The FBI, NYPD, DEA, and Italian magistrates like Giovanni Falcone worked together to crack the case. That kind of coordination was new, and it marked a real shift in how the authorities took on organized crime. This wasn't just a drug ring, it was the blueprint for modern global trafficking. It linked Sicilian producers to American distributors and laundered the profits with corporate-level precision. The pizza connection wasn't just clever, it was colossal. Second Mafia War. In 1981, Salvatore Totorina and his Corleonesi faction launched one of the deadliest campaigns in Mafia history. It was a full-on assault against the old Palermo bosses. Stefano Bontada, Salvatore Inzerillo, and Tano Badalamenti. These urban power players had long considered Riina and his allies as backward peasants from Corleone. That arrogance didn't age well. The Corleonesi hit fast and hard, leaving betrayal and bodies in their wake. The scale was staggering. Between 1981 and 1983, over 1,000 people were killed, mobsters, relatives, and more than a few bystanders caught in the crossfire. Bontad and Inzerillo were taken out in the first wave. What followed was a bloodbath that rolled through Sicily like a storm. The Corleonesi didn't just want control, they wanted annihilation. Riina turned his guns on the state too. In April of 1982, anti-mafia advocate Pio La Torre was assassinated. 5 months later, General Carlo Alberto Dalla Chiesa, sent to clean up Palermo, was murdered along with his wife and driver. Riina's goal was simple: destabilize the government's anti-mafia push and scare off anyone who stood in the way. In 1984, the Corleonesi even bombed a passenger train near Florence, killing 17, just to throw investigators off and create chaos. By 1984, the Corleonesi had wiped out or absorbed nearly every rival. The war ended with Riina at the top and everyone else either dead, disappeared, or exiled. He didn't just win, he rewrote the rules. His men, known for loyalty and cruelty, were installed in key positions across the island. Cosa Nostra was no longer a loose alliance. It was a dictatorship. The bloodshed triggered a backlash from inside the mafia itself. Some surviving members flipped. The most notable was Tommaso Buscetta, who fled to Brazil, got extradited, and finally broke the code of silence. Salvatore Contorno followed. These pentiti gave Italian prosecutors everything: names, operations, structure. Their testimonies laid the groundwork for the Maxi trial. That trial, which ran from 1986 to 1992, charged 475 mafiosi. 338 were convicted, 19 received life sentences. The court confirmed what many suspected. Cosa Nostra wasn't just a collection of criminal families. It was a coordinated, centralized organization. Riina didn't just get named. He got 26 life sentences. The trial shook the mafia's foundation and gave prosecutors real tools, including Article 416 bis, which formally recognized mafia conspiracy in law. But Riina wasn't done. When he was arrested in January of 1993, the retaliation was vicious. Bombings in Florence, Milan, and Rome killed 10 people and injured 93. It was terrorism, plain and simple. And then came the murders that broke the nation's heart. Giovanni Falcone in May, Paolo Borsellino in July. These were the magistrates who helped build the Maxi trial. Their deaths sparked mass protests and forced the government to go even harder. The war shattered the old mafia structure. It killed pluralism and replaced it with absolute Corleonesi control. It also backfired. The violence made the mafia a national issue. Legal reforms passed. Police actions intensified. The state finally saw Cosa Nostra not as a nuisance, but a threat to democracy. This was the most violent era in mafia history. Bloody, chaotic, and decisive. It ended with centralized power, a trail of corpses, and a legal war that finally put the organization in a defensive position. Riina's rise built an empire of fear. His fall opened the door to break it. Modern era and adaptation. After decades of headlines, gunfire, and courtroom drama, the mafia didn't vanish. It adapted. In the United States, the RICO Act passed in 1970 gave prosecutors the tools to take down entire criminal organizations by targeting their leaders for group conspiracies. By the 1980s, this approach had chipped away at the mafia's grip on cities like New York and Las Vegas. Mob-run casinos started folding, and corporate ownership moved in. Flashy suits gave way to corporate suits, but not because they wanted to. It was because the law started working. In Italy, the fallout from the Maxi trial and the murders of Falcone and Borsellino brought sweeping anti-mafia reforms. The government rolled out the 41 bis prison regime to isolate bosses, seized assets, and escalated the pressure. The mafia couldn't keep doing business the old way, so they stopped looking like gangsters and started acting like businessmen. They moved into real estate, hospitality, construction, and retail. Shell companies hid the cash. Tourism and oil markets gave them new pipelines, legal ones. In 2024, investigators uncovered a massive tax fraud involving over 500 million euros, run by both the Camorra and Cosa Nostra using missing trader firms across Europe. 1 year later, Italian authorities seized 140 million euros from businessmen tied to the Ndrangheta's oil scams. These guys aren't counting envelopes anymore. They're moving assets through brokerages and investment portfolios. Then there's cybercrime. Over 100 suspects tied to Italian mafia clans were arrested in 2025 for business email compromise and CEO fraud, netting over $11 million through fake invoices and shell accounts. They've traded baseball bats for keyboard shortcuts, digital fraud, ransomware, and crypto laundering are all now part of the Mafia's portfolio. Europol's even tracking how they're manipulating markets, not just shaking down storefronts. Scholars are now calling these groups resilient structured, basically too flexible to squash with traditional law enforcement, and they're not fighting each other like before. Italy's anti-mafia agency says the different clans are collaborating more, especially in drug trafficking and money laundering. Less blood, more business. The 'Ndrangheta is the biggest beast right now. This Calabrian crew has gone global. As of 2007, they controlled somewhere between 3.5 and 4% of Italy's GDP. That's not a typo. Through drug smuggling, contract skims, and foreign investment, they've gone way past old-school racketeering. Modern mafia clans operate in networks, not hierarchies. They build temporary partnerships, outsource risky jobs, and use tech to hide their tracks. Law enforcement is finally catching up. Interpol introduced silver notices to help trace and freeze criminal assets worldwide. Data analysts are even mapping out the networks to figure out where to strike. Take out just 5% of the highest connectivity members and you can disrupt over 70% of the mafia's entire structure. That's not a theory, it's the new blueprint. What we're seeing now isn't the end, it's the upgrade. Today's mafia doesn't look like the movies. It looks like a holding company, it files taxes. It knows its way around spreadsheets, but it's still the same machine. Built on profit, secrecy, and control. The only difference is now it wears a very expensive mask. Congrats on making it to the end. If you like this video, please show your support by hitting the like and subscribe button.